What if the oldest words about God weren't about a distant being in the heavens, but about what you feel right now? For centuries, we've been taught to imagine divinity as something external, unreachable, wrapped in mystery and power. But the earliest records don't describe a king in the sky, nor a separate entity. They point to something much simpler, and at the same time more disturbing. A short phrase, direct, almost enigmatic. I am. A forgotten code, not hidden in temples, but in the very experience of existing. Ancient civilizations built stone temples, raised priesthoods, and created religious hierarchies to keep humanity looking outward. Yet, in the midst of all that apparatus, the scriptures preserved a raw, unsettling truth. Divinity needed neither images nor intermediaries. It was enough to notice the act of being conscious, the simple fact of saying I am, and recognizing yourself as presence. This idea crossed millennia, always hidden in plain sight, because it was too direct to be accepted without resistance. Most people always expected grand explanations, complex names, spectacular myths to define the divine. Yet what we find is a naked verb, without ornaments. To be. The foundation of all human experience is not in tomorrow or the beyond, but in the simple awareness of existing now. That awareness, according to forgotten masters and misunderstood prophets, was God's own signature, not a title given by humans, but the password revealed by the creative source itself. This key, at once so simple and so radical, was often ignored or reinterpreted as mere metaphor. After all, to accept that the very act of existing is already the divine manifestation would mean placing the creative power inside each individual. There'd be no more distance between human and divine. No need for intermediaries, no waiting for outer signs. It would be enough to assume that the I am is absolute, and that everything that follows it shapes the lived reality. Through the centuries, this code was repeated, but rarely understood. Priests, theologians, and political leaders preferred to tame the idea, turning it into dogma, symbol, or unreachable mystery. Humanity grew used to seeking the divine as something far away, while the secret remained here, inside their own consciousness. The I am was recited in prayers, but its literal meaning dissolved into poetic metaphors that distanced rather than brought closer. The result was an almost perfect inversion. Instead of recognizing divine presence in the simple act of being alive, crowds began waiting for blessings from outside, as if creation were a favor granted by external forces. And yet the law kept operating silently. Whatever someone declares and feels after I am inevitably shapes their experience. What was lost wasn't the law's effectiveness, but the awareness of how it works. The I am is like a mathematical formula that never stops working. Whoever says I am weak is activating the same creative force that could be used to declare I am strong. Whoever affirms I am poor is using the same code that could generate I am prosperous. The verb doesn't judge, doesn't question, doesn't analyze. It only confirms. The universe doesn't distinguish metaphor from literal. It obeys the assumed state of consciousness. Thus, the first great revelation of this journey is realizing that the forgotten code wasn't hidden in cryptograms or occult mysteries. It was always right in front of us, repeated in every breath, inscribed in every thought, present in every emotion. The simple act of saying I am isn't casual. It's living proof that consciousness is the root of all reality, and rediscovering this is like opening a door that was never locked, but few had the courage to push. Picture a silent desert, where the wind stirs up dust and the heat scorches the skin. In that barren scene, a common man named Moses faced a phenomenon that defied all logic, a burning bush that was never consumed. There, before the fire that would not die, a voice emerged. It wasn't distant thunder, nor the speech of a hidden oracle. It was something more intimate, more direct, more disconcerting. To the question, "Who are you?" the answer brought no titles or mythologies, just two words: I am. That answer was radical because it broke with everything ancient cultures expected from a god. The Egyptians worshipped gods with multiple names, symbols, and attributes. The Canaanites and Mesopotamians described warrior, astral, or agricultural deities. What Moses heard had no genealogy, no form. It was a pure verb, absolute, impossible to imprison in images. I am that I am. a declaration that challenged the priests and put at risk the whole religious system based on external rituals. Notice the simplicity and depth of that divine name. While other peoples sought identity in gods that represented forces of nature, here divinity presented itself as existence itself, not as a being among others, but as the very foundation of being, not as a distant title, but as the same awareness pulsing in every human breath. That answer was less a name and more a mirror, reflecting in man the origin of all that is. Moses, stunned, must have felt more bewilderment than clarity, because that voice didn't offer him a ready-made religion, nor did it give him instructions on how to build monumental temples. It offered instead a living awareness that the mere act of existing was already the revelation. That fire, which never goes out, symbolized exactly this, the eternal presence that burns in each being but is never consumed. Not something external to be worshipped, but the inner flame to be recognized. That's why the episode of the burning bush echoed so strongly in biblical tradition. It marked the passage from a polytheistic, mythological vision to a direct, subjective experience of the divine. The God who speaks isn't in statues, doesn't demand grand sacrifices, doesn't describe itself with complex genealogies. It only declares, "I am." And in doing so, it reveals that the greatest of all spiritual keys isn't conquered from outside, but assumed from within in the awareness that dares to see itself as eternal. That divine name, "I am that I am," became so sacred that for centuries it was veiled, protected, almost forbidden to be spoken. The tetragram YHWH, which tried to record that revelation, was wrapped in mystery, replaced by titles like Lord, to avoid the boldness of facing its literal meaning. After all, if taken seriously, it would destroy the distance between man and God. It would turn every individual into a direct bearer of the creative spark. The desert scene, with fire and silence, is more than a religious story. It's a metaphor for the human condition itself. Every time you pause and notice the simple fact of existing, you stand before your own burning bush. Every time you ask, "Who am I?" the answer doesn't come in theories or dogmas, but in that same verb, "I am." The fire is the life burning in you, without consuming itself. The divine presence was never distant, only forgotten in the rush to seek outward. The impact of that answer crossed centuries, but was also slowly neutralized by dogmatic interpretations. The radical truth, that divinity is being itself, was coded in layers of symbols, rituals, and mediations. Yet the code remains there, intact. The fire of the bush still burns, waiting for those who dare to listen again without fear or intermediaries. "I am" is not just an ancient phrase. It is the ongoing revelation repeated in each of us right now. Centuries after the burning bush, another voice echoed, this time on the dusty streets of Roman Palestine. Jesus didn't appear with political titles nor as an official priest. He spoke with fishermen, peasants, women, and ordinary men. But in the midst of parables and miracles, he repeated a phrase that sounded scandalous to the religious of the time. "Before Abraham was, I am." The same declaration Moses had heard in the desert now came from human lips, unveiled, with almost unbearable boldness. For the listeners of that time, this phrase wasn't just poetic, it was blasphemy. Abraham was the founding patriarch, the revered ancestor. How could someone say he existed before him? The key was in the verb. Jesus wasn't speaking of his earthly biography, but of the eternal consciousness expressing itself through him. By saying "I am," he claimed the same identity revealed in the burning bush, not as metaphor but as living presence, available to all who dared to recognize it. Another decisive moment was when he declared, "I and the Father are one." He didn't say "I follow the Father" nor "I serve the Father." He dissolved the distance. He pointed out that human consciousness, when it recognizes its origin, is inseparable from the creative source. That statement subverted the whole religious structure that depended on intermediaries. If divinity expresses itself directly in human beings, who can monopolize access to it? Jesus challenged not only traditions, but the very foundation of religious power. That's why his words were met with such conflict. For some, they were liberation. For others, intolerable threat. The revelation that the "I am" was not exclusive to temples or priests, but present in every breath, opened the door to a new way of living. A life in which every feeling, every choice, every inner declaration became a creative act. Faith stopped being waiting and became active awareness. Throughout his teachings, Jesus reinforced this code repeatedly. He said, "I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the way, the truth, and the life." All these phrases had something in common. The I am as the foundation, followed by symbols revealing states of consciousness. They weren't religious metaphors in the usual sense, but instructions on how to assume states and manifest realities. He offered a direct map of how consciousness shapes human experience. The impact of these words is even stronger when we remember that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, a language where the verb to be carries immediate, absolute presence. He wasn't speaking of a distant future, but of the eternal now. The I am was a living password, repeated in his mouth to remind everyone that divinity is not far away, but vibrating in every thought and emotion held in the present. For the intellectuals of his time, this claim was unbearable because it erased spiritual hierarchy. There were no more privileges of caste, lineage, or priestly role. Everyone carried within themselves the same creative principle. What set Jesus apart wasn't having something others lacked, but the courage to affirm, live, and demonstrate that truth. And that was precisely the invitation he left, that each one recognize themselves as an extension of the I am. Thus, the central message of his revelation wasn't to worship a historical figure, but to assume the creative identity that was always available. When he said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," he wasn't offering a distant promise, but pointing to the most immediate reality. Consciousness is the temple, the heart is the altar, and the I am is the key that lights the flame. What began in the burning bush was now walking in flesh and bone among men. If Jesus' message was liberating, it was also profoundly dangerous. Dangerous not because it threatened individuals, but because it shook the foundations of entire institutions. The simple recognition that the I am dwells in every person could dissolve centuries of religious and political control. If every man and woman carries within themselves the creative spark, who needs priests to intercede? Who depends on complex rituals to approach God? Authority would pass from the hands of a few to the hearts of all. And that's exactly why the revelation was buried under layers of dogma. Through the centuries, religious leaders and rulers realized that an awakened humanity, conscious of its inner divinity, would be impossible to subjugate. It wouldn't obey out of fear, nor submit out of convenience. The I am lived in practice is a silent revolution. It frees the mind before freeing the body. It turns subjects into creators, and that always posed a risk to those who feed on power. The danger wasn't in rituals of faith, but in the fact that they'd become unnecessary. If prayer is not supplication, but inner command, then it can't be controlled. If blessing doesn't depend on external hierarchies, then no one has monopoly over grace. The message of the I am slowly corrodes any system that survives on the dependence of the faithful. That's why it had to be turned into a harmless symbol, a vague metaphor, a distant promise of a future paradise. Institutions understood early that the best way to neutralize power was to reinterpret it. They turned the revelation into dogma, into inaccessible mystery, into something reserved only for saints or exceptional figures. Meanwhile, ordinary people were convinced they couldn't dare to call themselves divine. Humility was confused with submission, and reverence with blind obedience. The flame of the burning bush burning inside everyone was hidden under the veil of rituals and liturgies, but history shows that not even the thickest walls can extinguish the spark. Mystics, visionaries, and thinkers in every age rediscovered the code of the I am and defied the status quo. Many were persecuted, burned, silenced, not because they preached empty heresies, but because they touched society's most sensitive nerve. The idea that power is within, not outside, that the Creator is not distant, but lives in the consciousness of every awakened human being. This is the contradiction that crosses centuries. Religion promises liberation, yet fears absolute freedom, because a human being who knows they are Creator no longer lets themselves be manipulated by fear of divine punishment. They don't need indulgences, don't depend on dogmas, don't fear the invented hell. They understand that every state of consciousness is heaven or hell lived here and now. That's the danger. When the individual realizes they need no one to connect with the infinite. The irony is that the texts never hid this truth. The problem wasn't the absence of information, but the excess of interpretation. The I am was read as metaphor, as poetry, as future promise. Almost no one dared to take it literally. Almost no one assumed those words spoke of the immediate present, of consciousness itself as the stage of creation. Thus, the secret wasn't erased, only layered so that few had the courage to decode it. The danger of inner freedom, then, is double. For institutions, it is the loss of control. For the individual, it is the weight of responsibility. Because to assume yourself as creator also means recognizing that every pain and every failure were, in some way, unconscious manifestations. There are no more external culprits, only inner states reflected in the world. This truth can be frightening, but it's also the only one that frees. The I am returns the power, and with it, responsibility for your own life. Have you noticed how often what you fear most ends up happening? It's not coincidence nor blind fate. It's the law operating silently, obediently, impartially. The universe doesn't distinguish between a desire and a fear. It only responds to the state of consciousness sustained. When someone lives with the constant sense of failure, that vibration becomes command. When someone breathes confidence, the world around seems to conspire in their favor. What is felt with intensity becomes fact. This is the mechanism of unconscious creation. While most imagine they're victims of circumstances, they're actually giving invisible orders to their own subconscious. The conscious mind thinks, desires, projects, but the subconscious only records what is felt as real. Vibrant fear, repeated anxiety, accumulated anger. All these are seeds cast into the fertile soil of the subconscious. And that soil doesn't question. It only makes grow what it was given, whether fruit or poison. What we call bad luck is nothing more than the repetition of unobserved emotional states. A person who lives expecting rejection will end up collecting proof of rejection. One who constantly fears lack of money will see their finances corroded by setbacks. One who feels unworthy of love will repeat relationships that confirm that feeling. There is no mystery. Outer life only mirrors inner content. The law doesn't sleep, doesn't fail, doesn't choose sides. It simply fulfills. Neville Goddard was blunt when he said, "You don't attract what you want, but what you are conscious of being." That phrase sums up the whole operation. To desire something is to keep it distant, like an unreachable horizon. To assume yourself as what you desire is to plant in the subconscious the certainty that it already exists. It's that state of anticipated possession, felt with intensity, that rearranges external events. The material world, sooner or later, bends to what has already been set in the invisible. That's why so many people pray without results. Words spoken mechanically have no power at all. What really moves the gears of creation is the emotion behind the word. If someone asks for blessings but keeps their heart tied to fear, it's fear that the subconscious records. If someone begs for health but feels condemned, it's illness that strengthens. True prayer is not supplication. It is assumed feeling. It's not asking. It's clothing yourself with the result already fulfilled. This mechanism isn't limited to life's great issues. It operates in everyday details. The late bus, the cutting glance, the email that never arrives, the unexpected encounter, all are reflections of inner states. Outer life is like a mirror. And like every mirror, it doesn't show what you'd like to see, only what's in front of it. Consciousness creates without rest, whether you know it or not. The problem isn't that the law doesn't work, but that it works all the time. The most disturbing part of this revelation is realizing there's no escape, there is no chance. There is no cosmic injustice that ignores your inner states. This means every tragedy and every victory carry the signature of consciousness itself. Not in the shallow sense of blaming yourself for everything, but in the deeper sense of recognizing that nothing escapes the creative field of the I am. Even suffering is born from states cultivated unconsciously. To recognize this mechanism is like finding the hidden manual of reality. It's realizing the world was never your enemy, but only your reflection, that the subconscious is not a judge, but a faithful servant, and that every intense emotion is an order materializing on life's stage. From this point on, there are no more excuses. The inevitable question is not, what will the world do to me, but what state am I choosing to sustain? Because from it, the next chapter of your existence will be born. For centuries, we were taught to imagine prayer as supplication, an act of asking something from a distant being like begging a king for a rare gift. But Neville Goddard broke with that view by saying that prayer is not request, but creation. To pray is not to convince an external God to intervene, but to instruct the subconscious to manifest what has already been felt as real. Prayer, in this sense, is not spoken word, it is assumed state. This shift in perspective is revolutionary, because instead of kneeling and waiting, the individual is invited to rise in awareness. It's not about begging for something to happen, but about inwardly assuming it already has. This is the secret of assuming the end. When you see yourself already in the desired result with full emotion, the subconscious receives that order as a finished fact. And then, without apparent effort, the outer world begins to rearrange itself to confirm it. Neville said that true prayer is feeling. Words, if empty, are nothing but echo. But an emotional state lived with intensity is absolute command. Picture someone desiring prosperity. If they pray with fear and despair, they reinforce scarcity. But if they pray feeling the relief, gratitude, and safety of already possessing, they plant in the subconscious the certainty of abundance. And it's that certainty that materializes. The secret isn't speaking louder, but feeling deeper. Prayer, in this model, doesn't happen only in temples or solemn moments. It's present in every instant you sustain an emotional state. When you clothe yourself in joy, you're already praying for the joy to come. When you surrender to sadness, you're unconsciously praying for it to repeat. Every dominant emotion is a living prayer, and the subconscious responds without judgment, without filter, only fulfilling. The whole of life is liturgy. That's why Neville insisted so much on the moment before sleep. There, between wakefulness and dream, the rational mind relaxes and the subconscious opens like fertile soil. Prayer in that state doesn't need words. It's enough to assume the desired end and feel it as an anticipated memory. The body may be lying in a modest bed, but the awareness already sees itself in the dreamed home. The body may carry symptoms, but the mind already experiences vitality. The world obeys the state assumed within. The practical secret of prayer is understanding that it's not about effort, but surrender, not creating through tension, but through naturalness. The more natural the desired state feels, the faster it's accepted by the subconscious. This is why detailed imagination is so powerful. It tricks the sense of reality until the new state feels as plausible as the old one. At that moment, prayer stops being a request and becomes an order already fulfilled. This understanding doesn't deny traditional spirituality. On the contrary, it gives meaning to it. Prayers that once seemed unanswered didn't fail from lack of faith, but from excess of fear. When someone begs with desperation, they affirm to the subconscious the permanence of pain. But when someone assumes the end without anxiety, they turn prayer into certainty. That subtle difference separates eternal waiting from inevitable manifestation. Thus, prayer stops being a bargaining chip with the divine and becomes the language of consciousness with itself. It's not a right reserved for sages or saints, but a power accessible to any human being who understands their own nature. The practical secret of prayer is this: feel now what you wish to live later, because in the realm of consciousness, there is no later. There is only the eternal present of the I am. If consciousness is divine and creative, why then are we born forgetting that fact? That's the question spanning centuries of philosophy and spirituality. The deeper answer is not that it's a mistake, but a deliberate choice. Like an actor diving into a role to live the drama with intensity, infinite consciousness dresses in forgetfulness to experience life in its fullness. The veil is not punishment. It is an essential part of the game. Without forgetting, there'd be no surprise. Imagine an actor who, upon stepping on stage, already knows every reaction, every ending, every applause. The play would lose its force. The same way, infinite consciousness must pretend not to be creator in order to truly feel fear, overcoming, love, loss. Only one who forgets can be moved by reunion. Only one who feels limited can experience the victory of expansion. Forgetfulness is the spice that gives flavor to existence. Ancient traditions always knew this. Plato spoke of anamnesis, the soul that, upon incarnating, forgets the truth and must recall it little by little. In the East, the veil of Maya symbolizes the illusion that covers reality. In Christian mysticism, the fall is not just sin, but necessary descent into the human drama. In all these traditions, the idea is the same. Forgetting is the doorway that allows awakening. Only those who sleep can awaken. This forgetting, however, is not absolute. It's like a fogged glass. The view is blurred, but the light still passes through. Intuitions, dreams, coincidences, flashes of inspiration are the moments when greater consciousness remembers who it is. They are cracks in the veil, sudden reminders that life is wider than it seems. In those fissures, the I Am slips through and invites the human being to remember their true nature. But there's a price in this process. Forgetting allows creation, but also opens space for suffering. Whoever doesn't remember their divine origin tends to feel victimized, lost, separate. They live searching for meaning, like someone walking in the dark. And yet, it's precisely that sense of emptiness that drives the search. Pain is often the strongest invitation to awakening. In absence, the desire for reunion with the whole is born. Neville Goddard said that the game of life is falling into the character, then remembering to be the author. That is the essence of forgetting. Consciousness agrees to live as a common human, with limitations, fears, and doubts, only to one day, amid the drama, remember it was always the creator. Awakening doesn't deny the role played, but reveals that the stage never limited the actor. Everything was seen, and the scene was always under the command of the I Am. This perspective radically changes the way of looking at one's own pains. Instead of curse, they become part of the chosen plot. Instead of injustice, they become necessary contrast. Every tear, every fall, every apparent failure is a chapter of a larger script, in which consciousness exercises and recognizes itself. Forgetting is not prison, but training. It is the silence before the music, the emptiness before the explosion of memory. Thus, to understand forgetting as part of the process is also to ease the weight of life. We are not here to suffer endlessly, but to remember. And every time you see yourself as more than a body, more than a personal story, more than a social role, the veil thins. The game begins to reveal itself. And the great surprise is realizing that the creator was always present, only waiting for the right moment to be remembered. The instant when the human looks inward and dares to say again, I am. One of Neville Goddard's most provocative ideas is that there are no victims in the ultimate sense, only creators who forgot their authorship. That statement may sound brutal, almost insensitive, but it carries relentless logic. If consciousness is the only reality, then everything we live is born from it, consciously or unconsciously. Pains, failures, rejections, nothing escapes the law. They are not external punishments, but results of inner states sustained with intensity. This means that every suffering carries a mirror. The rejection endured may reveal a state of unworthiness cultivated in silence. Financial ruin may reflect years of constant fear of loss. Illness may symbolize unresolved resentments or guilt. The subconscious does not judge, it only fulfills. It manifests love and despair with the same fidelity. What is felt as truth, sooner or later, crystallizes on life's stage. This shift in perspective is uncomfortable because it destroys the victim narrative. It's easier to believe we are prisoners of chance, or that unjust forces govern our fate. Harder is to face that we ourselves gave the command, even unconsciously. The price of freedom is responsibility, and total responsibility means assuming there are no culprits outside us, only inner states that must be transformed. At the same time, this revelation is liberating, because if we were able to create pain without noticing, we can also create joy consciously. If unconscious states shaped the past, chosen states can shape the future. The creator disguised as victim discovers the key was always in their hands. Just change what you feel, and the scenery will begin to change. The power that once seemed distant returns to the center of your own awareness. But this process requires courage, because it's not just about swapping surface thoughts, but diving into the deep emotions that sustain experiences. Often, behind the complaint lies a secret attachment to the victim role. Being a victim brings attention, compassion, excuses. To give up that role is to let go of justifications and accept the weight of authorship. It's to say, if I created this by accident, I can create something better on purpose. The creator disguised as victim must learn to observe feelings as seeds. Every resentment kept is a seed of future pain. Every fear fed is a seed of limitation. Every act of gratitude or trust is a seed of expansion. The soil of the subconscious does not distinguish which is which. It is up to the individual to decide what to plant. This awareness transforms even suffering into opportunity for awakening. Neville didn't soften this truth. He said the law is neutral and infallible. Just as fire warms or burns depending on its use, consciousness creates life or pain according to the state sustained. Responsibility is absolute, but freedom is too. The creator disguised as victim discovers they were never powerless, only unconscious. And that the same energy that generated tragedies can, when redirected, generate miracles. Thus, the turning point is not to deny the suffering lived, but to reinterpret it as consequence of past states. This understanding opens a new path, that of creating consciously from now on. The weight of the victim dissolves and the author awakens. And in that awakening, life ceases to be something that happens to us and becomes something that happens through us. The I Am retakes its throne, revealing there was never an external executioner nor savior, only consciousness creating. Neville Goddard didn't just repeat scriptures, he decoded them as one who finds a forgotten code. For him, consciousness was not an abstract concept, but a functional structure. There was the conscious, responsible for thinking, choosing, and directing, and there was the subconscious, receptive, fertile, incapable of denying what is given to it. Between the two, there was an invisible bridge, feeling. That was the secret link that turned ideas into tangible realities. According to Neville, the conscious is the masculine part of the mind, active, projective, able to choose among alternatives. The subconscious is the feminine part, receptive, creative, giving form to what it receives. But the decisive detail is that the subconscious doesn't understand logical reasoning, only emotions felt as real. That's why so many ideas remain ineffective. Only emotion imprints. Without feeling, there is no creation. The subconscious doesn't hear words, it hears emotional vibrations. This model explains why so many rational efforts fail. A person may repeat a positive affirmation 1,000 times, but if deep down they feel doubt or fear, it's that feeling that is recorded. The conscious may try to deceive, but the subconscious won't be persuaded by empty words. Only what is felt with intensity becomes command. Thus, surface thoughts dissolve, while deep emotions silently shape life. Neville affirmed that this law is universal. It doesn't depend on religion, culture, or belief. It works in everyone all the time, whether we recognize it or not. It's like gravity. It doesn't need our faith to operate. Every human being is already creating their reality, consciously or unconsciously, by the way they feel. The difference between those who transform life and those who feel imprisoned by it lies only in the degree of awareness of this process. To make this practical, Neville developed techniques that explored specific states of consciousness. The most powerful of them was the state near sleep, when the rational mind relaxes and the subconscious is open. In that threshold between wake and dream, any image or emotion sustained sinks deep, like a seed in fertile soil. That's why he advised, fall asleep feeling the wish already fulfilled. This is the moment when creation is most effective. Another central key is understanding that the subconscious doesn't distinguish between reality and imagination. For it, what is felt is absolute. If you imagine with intensity, the subconscious records it as fact. This explains why persistent fears become tragedies and why dreams lived emotionally can become achievements. The subconscious doesn't assess plausibility. It only accepts what it is given with consistent emotion. Neville saw in this mechanism the practical confirmation of Jesus' words when he said, "Whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." He wasn't speaking of a future promise, but of a present technique. True prayer is assuming the end, feeling the result as already fulfilled. Faith, in this context, is loyalty to the chosen state, even when appearances contradict it. The outer world is only a delayed reflection of what has already been set within. Thus, the mechanics of the law reveal we are not facing mystery, but operation. The conscious thinks, the subconscious manifests, the feeling connects. This triad governs all existence. Knowing this is like holding the manual of creation. And the great question is not whether the law works, but how we are using it. Because life, whether we like it or not, is always the faithful projection of what consciousness dares to feel as truth. If consciousness creates, the big question is how to direct that creation consciously. Neville Goddard answered clearly, there are protocols, states, and techniques that allow the individual to impress on the subconscious what they wish to live. These are not magical formulas, but inner conditions that favor correct planting. The secret is not to force, but to feel. The first of these states is the moment of drowsiness, known as SATS, state akin to sleep. Neville explained that between waking and sleep, the rational mind dissolves. At that threshold, resistance falls, and the subconscious becomes completely receptive. In that instant, imagination takes on absolute creative power. That's why, before sleeping, he advised choosing a desire and treating it not as future, but as already fulfilled, feeling the result as an anticipated memory. Falling asleep in that state is planting the seed in the most fertile soil of the mind. Another fundamental protocol is the law of reversibility. If an intense emotion can create a reality, then every reality can be reconstructed by returning to the corresponding emotion. Neville taught that nothing is lost. A house, a relationship, an opportunity can be recreated by reassuming the corresponding state. The invisible does not vanish. It remains in potential, waiting to be reactivated by the consciousness that dares to feel it again. The practice of reversibility requires detail. It's not enough to imagine vaguely. It's necessary to relive the scene sensorially. See the light, hear the sounds, touch the objects, feel the texture. The subconscious does not distinguish between memory and creation. For it, what is felt is fact. That's why the more specific and vivid the imagination, the stronger the impression. Documented stories show people recovering houses, objects, and opportunities that seemed lost forever. There is also the protocol of emotional fidelity. Neville warned it's not enough to assume the end for a few minutes, and then spend the rest of the day feeding doubt and fear. The subconscious responds to the dominant state, not the momentary one. Creation requires consistency, like watering a planted seed daily. This doesn't mean obsessively watching every thought, but cultivating inner firmness in the chosen state until it becomes natural, almost automatic. These protocols reveal that imagination is not fantasy, but laboratory. Each inner rehearsal, when sustained with emotion, is a command to the subconscious. The mistake most make is confusing desire with possession. Desire keeps the object distant. Assumption puts it in the present. Those who desire repeat lack. Those who assume already live fulfillment. That difference is subtle, but it's what separates a life of waiting from a life of conscious manifestation. Another essential point is naturalness. The more natural it feels to sustain the chosen state, the faster it will manifest. The secret lies in cultivating the sensation as if it were obvious, almost ordinary. When consciousness stops fighting and begins to accept the new state as real, the subconscious receives it without resistance. Manifestation doesn't happen by effort, but by inevitability. The external reorganizes to match the internal. Thus, Neville's protocols form a kind of map. SATS, reversibility, fidelity, sensory detailing, and naturalness. Each of them is a key to directing the law that already operates in all of us. The difference is that now creation ceases to be unconscious and becomes intentional. It is not magic, but the science of consciousness. The universe responds not because the individual begs, but because they dare to assume, I am already in the desired result. If consciousness creates realities, why then do so many remain trapped in cycles of pain and limitation? Neville Goddard replied, because the law is infallible, but its application is usually unconscious. The first trap is confusing desire with possession. Desire reinforces lack, because it keeps the object always in the future. Assumption is wearing the state in the present, even when nothing external confirms it. Those who desire remain waiting. Those who assume already live. Another trap is obsession with the means. The conscious mind wants to control every step, imagine every detail of how something will happen. But by insisting on visualizing obstacles and stages, the person imprints on the subconscious precisely those obstacles. Neville warned, concern yourself only with the end. The path organizes itself. Every time you think, "How will it happen?" you are planting seeds of difficulty. True faith doesn't calculate means, it only assumes the result. The third mistake is living trapped in doubt. Many experience brief moments of assuming the end, but spend the rest of the day feeding anxiety, fear, or disbelief. The subconscious doesn't respond to the exception, but to the dominant state. Emotional fidelity is more important than fleeting intensity. That's why those who constantly alternate between faith and doubt end up registering only instability, and life manifests in cycles of uncertainty. Another powerful trap is guilt. Many carry the weight of past mistakes and believe they don't deserve prosperity, love, or health. But the subconscious doesn't distinguish past from present. Every time someone relives guilt, they're reprinting in the now the sense of unworthiness. Neville said the true sin is not breaking external rules, but feeling separated from what you desire to be. To sin is to miss the mark, and the mark is always the inner state. Fear, too, is a relentless creator. How many times have you mentally anticipated a disaster, and it materialized almost exactly as imagined? It wasn't premonition, it was unconscious creation. The universe doesn't judge whether the feeling is desired or not. It only confirms. Whoever sustains terror crystallizes terror. Whoever sustains certainty crystallizes certainty. Fear, when cultivated, is negative prayer, and the subconscious fulfills it with the same efficiency it would fulfill faith. Another mistake is believing that repeating words is enough. Saying "I am rich" or "I am healthy" 1,000 times has no effect if the feeling behind it is lack. The subconscious ignores empty phrases and records only consistent emotions. The rational mind can be deceived by speeches, but the heart does not lie. If deep down you feel poor or sick, that is what will be recorded. That's why the key is not to repeat, but to feel. There is also the trap of hurry. Many give up before the chosen state has time to take root. Manifestation doesn't follow the human calendar, but the rhythm of inner assimilation. Whoever plants a seed and digs it up every day to check if it has sprouted will never see fruit. So it is with consciousness. Patience, consistency, and trust are needed. The outer life will always yield, but only when the inner root is firm. These traps show that the danger is not the law failing, but working too well. The outer world always responds, whether to emotions clearly chosen or to feelings left to chance. That's why Neville insisted on inner discipline. It's not about repressing emotions, but redirecting them. Empty the cup of anger, fear, or doubt, and fill it immediately with the sensation of the desired state. Because in the end, life has no choice. It must reflect what you sustain as truth. If life is a stage where consciousness wears roles, forgetting was never failure. It was choice. And like every play, this drama also has an inevitable ending. Sooner or later, every human being will be led to remember their creative nature. No matter how long it takes, how many falls are needed, how many illusions are lived. The destiny of consciousness is always awakening, because that which pretends to be limited cannot forever forget it is infinite. This awakening is not uniform. For some, it comes as a sudden flash, a revelation that changes everything in an instant. For others, it's a slow process made of uncomfortable questions, silent searches, small signs that pile up until the veil can no longer hold. But in every case, there is a turning point, a moment when the individual realizes they are not just victim of the world, but its author, and that moment is irreversible. Pain, far from punishment, plays an essential role in this process. Every suffering is an invitation to remember. Every tragedy, however harsh, carries the seed of a revelation. The emptiness of loss forces the search for what cannot be lost. The limitation of the body leads to the discovery of the spirit. The injustice of the outer world forces the gaze inward. Thus, suffering ceases to be punishment and becomes part of the script that leads to awakening. Even death, feared as the end, is reinterpreted in this paradigm. Neville said consciousness cannot die because it is the one that invented the concept of death. The body is only a disposable costume, and each transition is like falling asleep in one world and waking up in another. The fear of the end dissolves when you realize you are life itself, experiencing passing forms. In this sense, death doesn't interrupt the play, it only changes the scenery. Awakening is also not a privilege of a few enlightened ones. It is the destiny of all, even if at different times. Some awaken early to help others remember, like actors who enter the stage first. Others only remember in the final act, but in the end, no one is left behind. Eternal consciousness doesn't lose fragments of itself. Every soul, no matter how lost it seems, will eventually recall the code, I am. This certainty changes even the way of living the present. When you understand awakening is inevitable, haste disappears. There is no race to reach the divine, because the divine is already here. What exists is only the choice to remember now or later. And the sooner you remember, the fuller the experience becomes. Life stops being survival and becomes conscious creation. The stage is not prison, but opportunity. The final revelation is this: everything we seek, we already are. There is no power outside, no distant salvation, no chance ruling. There is only consciousness playing human until it tires of the game and reclaims its kingship. This is the inevitable destiny, to remember that every I am is the voice of the eternal, speaking through a fleeting moment. The Creator was never absent. It only disguised itself as creature, and so the journey closes like a perfect circle. What began at the burning bush passed through the words of Jesus, echoed in Neville's boldness, and manifested in each technique, culminates here, in awakening. No matter how deep the illusion, the truth is inescapable. Sooner or later, each will say, not as belief but as direct experience, I am. And in that moment all seeking ends, because the seeker discovers they always were what they were searching for.